The European Union is feeling the strain as Hungary's potential shift towards the BRICS alliance raises serious concerns about the future of European unity and global power dynamics. Prime Minister Viktor Orbán's government has been actively seeking alternatives beyond the EU's traditional sphere. With rising tensions between Budapest and Brussels, Hungary's future alignment is becoming a hot topic, especially as the EU navigates its internal divisions. The EU has already frozen billions in recovery funds meant for Hungary, citing democratic backsliding as the main concern. Orbán and his allies see this as an overreach, a direct challenge to Hungary's sovereignty. Known for his nationalist stance, Orbán has consistently clashed with the EU, aligning himself with controversial figures like Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, and offering vocal support for former US President Donald Trump moves that have unsettled many in Europe. Orbán has frequently obstructed EU decision-making, vetoing proposals on critical issues like Ukraine funding and EU membership processes. From his perspective, Brussels is trying to control Hungary's internal governance, prompting a fierce pushback. As relations with the EU have deteriorated, Hungary has been cultivating closer ties with China and Russia, participating in China's Belt and Road Initiative and relying heavily on Russian energy exports. Hungary sees BRICS as a possible alternative to its current economic structure. Currently, Hungary is deeply intertwined with the EU market and relies heavily on Western financial systems. However, stronger connections with BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, could help diversify its economic relationships and lessen dependence on the EU. Here's the challenge. Hungary's economy is heavily reliant on the EU, with over 80% of its exports going to EU member states. A pivot toward BRICS could create new opportunities, but would also risk straining Hungary's essential trade relationships. Additionally, Hungary receives billions of euros from the EU to support domestic infrastructure, education, healthcare, and overall economic development. Recently, the EU has started reclaiming hundreds of millions of euros earmarked for Hungary after the country missed a deadline to pay a significant fine for violating EU asylum rules. The fine, initially 200 million euros, grows by 1 million euros daily until it's paid. Should Hungary choose to distance itself further from the EU, the financial shortfall could be difficult for BRICS nations to fill. Orbán is treading a fine line, aiming to assert Hungary's independence while exploring new alliances. However, he cannot afford to completely sever ties with the European Union. This balancing act could have significant consequences not only for Hungary, but for the broader geopolitical landscape of Europe. Hungary's potential alignment with BRICS could complicate its membership in key organizations like NATO and the EU, pillars of European security and economic cooperation for decades. With Western alliances increasingly viewing Russia and China as strategic adversaries, Hungary's move toward BRICS might be seen as a challenge to U.S. global financial dominance and the liberal democratic order established by the West after World War II. In Europe, Hungary could risk isolation and marginalization if it is perceived as a disruptive force against EU interests. In the corridors of European democracy, tensions between Prime Minister Viktor Orbán and EU lawmakers have reached a boiling point, reflecting a clash of ideologies. Despite widespread condemnation of Russia's war, Orbán is seemingly betting that aligning with BRICS will bring more benefits than risks. A significant part of this calculation lies in Hungary's energy situation, as the country depends heavily on Russia for over 80% of its natural gas, making it an outlier within the EU. While most EU countries have reduced reliance on Russian energy since the 2014 annexation of Crimea, Hungary has moved in the opposite direction, solidifying its energy ties with Russia. This includes a deal to expand Hungary's Pax nuclear power plant with Russian backing. Hungary's energy dependence has put it at odds with the EU, especially concerning sanctions against Russia. While many EU members support stringent sanctions to punish Russia for its actions in Ukraine, Orbán has criticized them, arguing that they harm European economies more than they affect Russia. Hungary's potential pivot to BRICS can be seen as an extension of this energy policy. By strengthening ties with Russia and other BRICS nations, Hungary may be attempting to secure its energy future and resist EU pressure to join sanctions against Russia. However, this approach is risky and likely unsustainable in the long term. The EU is already considering measures to penalize member states that defy its foreign policy, which could include withholding funds or invoking Article 7 of the EU treaty, allowing for the suspension of a member state's rights if they violate EU values. Additionally, the EU has introduced a mechanism linking funding to adherence to the rule of law, aimed at addressing democratic backsliding in countries like Hungary and Poland. This could become a powerful tool for the EU to push back against governments that stray from its principles. As Hungary weighs its potential pivot toward BRICS, its impact on regional alliances will also be profound. Orbán, who has been Hungary's prime minister since 2010, must carefully navigate this complex political landscape. Viktor Orbán's stance on migration has become increasingly rigid, to the point where he now uses harsh rhetoric to criticize EU policies aimed at distributing the migration burden across European nations. The Visegrad Group, comprising Hungary, Poland, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia, has long been a powerful force within the EU, often uniting to challenge EU policies, particularly on migration and national sovereignty. However, Hungary's growing relationship with Russia and China is beginning to strain this alliance. Poland, especially, is deeply worried about Russian aggression, particularly after the invasion of Ukraine. Hungary's more accommodating approach toward Moscow has created a rift between these once close partners. A clear example is Hungary's position on the Ukraine conflict. While most EU nations, including Poland, have strongly supported Ukraine by sending military aid and advocating for tough sanctions on Russia, Hungary has taken a different route. Orbán has opposed sending weapons to Ukraine and has criticized EU sanctions, arguing that they harm European economies more than they impact Russia. This divergence has not sat well with Hungary's neighbors. Poland and Slovakia, both bordering Ukraine, have been vocal in their support for Kyiv, leading to public disagreements with Hungary. These differences, especially concerning Ukraine, have tested the once solid bonds between the Visegrad nations. But the tension isn't limited to Ukraine. Hungary's deepening economic ties with China, especially through the Belt and Road Initiative, have raised concerns among its Central European allies. While all Visegrad countries have welcomed Chinese investment to some extent, Hungary has been particularly enthusiastic, sometimes at the expense of broader EU unity on issues involving China. This situation has other Central and Eastern European countries carefully observing Hungary's moves. Some might be tempted to follow Hungary's lead by seeking closer ties with BRICS nations as a way to diversify their economic partnerships and gain more influence within the EU. Others, however, may distance themselves from Hungary if they believe its actions are jeopardizing their relationships with Brussels or Washington. The potential fragmentation of regional alliances like the Visegrad Group could significantly shift the balance of power within the EU. These alliances have traditionally acted as a counterbalance to the dominance of larger Western European nations like Germany and France. If weakened or dissolved, the result could be a more centralized EU, ironically, the very thing Orbán claims to oppose. Migration pressures have been a persistent challenge in Europe, especially for EU member states with external borders. For years, Hungary has argued that once migrants enter, it's nearly impossible to send them back, with Orbán advocating for solutions outside Europe's borders. Looking at Hungary's potential shift toward BRICS, the long-term consequences are uncertain. No EU member has ever attempted to align so closely with an alternative bloc while still remaining within the Union. The crucial question is whether Hungary can strengthen its ties with BRICS without losing essential support from the EU. Hungary's economy is deeply interconnected with the EU, which remains its largest trading partner, raising doubts about the feasibility of this balancing act. The European Union also provides crucial funding for Hungary's infrastructure projects, agricultural subsidies, and regional development efforts. Should Hungary lean too heavily toward BRICS, it risks losing access to these vital resources and facing potential trade barriers with its EU partners. The economic fallout could be severe, with the possibility of job losses, decreased foreign investment, and even a currency crisis if global markets lose faith in Hungary's economic stability. However, if Hungary can skillfully manage this balancing act, it might see significant advantages. Strengthened ties with BRICS could open new markets for Hungarian exports, attract investments from emerging economies, and boost Hungary's geopolitical influence. But this decision isn't purely about economics. It's also deeply rooted in politics and national identity. Orbán has built much of his political image on defending Hungary's sovereignty from what he sees as EU overreach. His supporters view him as a protector against globalization and liberal values that they believe Brussels is imposing. However, any drastic move to distance Hungary from the EU could spark domestic resistance, as polls consistently show that most Hungarians support EU membership, even if they are critical of some EU policies. Many, particularly the younger generations, value the freedom of movement and economic opportunities that come with EU membership. Orbán faces a delicate balancing act. He needs to project strength and independence to his supporters, standing up to Brussels while forming new alliances, but he also cannot afford to alienate the EU or lose the economic benefits tied to its membership. The success of Hungary's strategy depends on Orbán's ability to navigate this complex geopolitical landscape, balancing Hungary's interests with the competing pressures from the EU, NATO, and BRICS. The stakes are high, and the outcome will not only affect Hungary, but also the future of European integration and the global balance of power. A focal point in this tension is the ongoing conflict between Orbán and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. Their clashes have intensified over the years and recently escalated in a public confrontation. In a European Parliament speech, von der Leyen criticized Hungary's visa policies and its stance on EU immigration rules, labeling them as threats to EU sovereignty. This term is controversial, as it suggests that EU authority should override national decisions on immigration and border control. Orbán, never one to shy away from a fight, responded with a sharp critique, accusing the EU of hypocrisy, particularly in its handling of democracy. He argued that the EU's version of democracy is merely a facade masking what he views as an increasingly authoritarian, centralized power structure in Brussels. This confrontation is more than just political theater. It reflects a deeper power struggle across Europe. On one side is Orbán, whose influence is growing both within Hungary and beyond. On the other is Ursula von der Leyen, whose position appears to be weakening, particularly with the ongoing crisis in Ukraine further complicating the EU's political landscape. The conflict in Ukraine has become a major point of contention between Orbán and the EU leadership. Ursula von der Leyen strongly advocated for significant support for Ukraine, including imposing harsh sanctions on Russia. However, this approach has backfired dramatically, leading to severe economic hardship across Europe. In contrast, Orbán adopted a more cautious approach from the outset. He supported maintaining energy ties with Russia and expressed skepticism about the EU's handling of the conflict. At the time, his stance was unpopular with many EU leaders. Yet, as the economic fallout from the sanctions has become more apparent, Orbán's warnings are resonating with a growing number of Europeans. Germany, the economic engine of the EU, is now on the verge of a serious recession, driven largely by the deindustrialization caused by sanctions and the halt of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Other European economies are struggling too, and even mainstream outlets like the London Times are beginning to acknowledge these failures, just as Orbán had foreseen. This economic crisis is reshaping Europe's political landscape. Support for Orbán's vision is growing, not just in Hungary, but in other parts of the continent as well. Political movements aligned with his ideology are gaining traction in countries like Austria and Germany, tapping into widespread discontent with EU leadership and a desire for more national autonomy. As this sentiment gains momentum, von der Leyen's influence within the EU is weakening. More people, and even entire political parties, are questioning the centralized control that Brussels exerts over member states. Orbán's vision of a more decentralized EU is becoming increasingly appealing to those seeking alternatives. This ideological conflict could fundamentally reshape the EU in the coming years. Leaders like Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, who once aligned with Orbán, are now shifting their support to von der Leyen's camp. These swing figures could play a pivotal role in determining the outcome of this power struggle. Thanks for watching The Global Narrative, and see you in the next video.